Hello everybody, and welcome to the first video in our new unit. And this unit is going to be all about something called macromolecules. So first, just like any other unit, I want to spend some time talking about why it's important to study macromolecules. So it turns out macromolecules are a type of molecule that is called an organic molecule, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. But what's kind of cool about organic molecules is there are a small number of patterns that repeat themselves over and over again in different organic molecules. And depending on which pattern a molecule has, that will dictate what properties that molecule has. So therefore, if we study organic molecules and we kind of learn to recognize these patterns, we can predict how molecules will interact, which is important for understanding how molecules interact in our body. So living things have a lot of diversity because there are a lot of different molecules that exist in living things. However, because these molecules are made up of a relatively small number of patterns, if we learn to recognize these patterns and understand what properties they give a molecule, we'll be able to better predict how molecules react in the body. So before we can go any further, we have to talk about what an organic molecule is. So basically, there are two different types of molecules. There are organic compounds and inorganic compounds. And the definition is pretty simple. An organic compound is defined as anything that is carbon-based. It has carbon as the main atom that's present in that molecule. Living things are carbon-based. Living things are organic. We are made up of many, many organic molecules. Now, we also have inorganic compounds in our bodies as well, but because we are living, most living things have carbon. So some carbon-based molecules might be something like a carbohydrate or a protein, and inorganic compounds, some examples are things like water or salt. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule. A big one that you should be familiar with is that carbon dioxide is technically considered inorganic, even though it does technically have carbon. So to summarize, both types of molecules are found in living things, but living things are primarily made up of organic compounds. So carbon is we're lucky to be made out of carbon because carbon can do a lot of things that allows it to make lots of different diverse molecules. So first of all, carbon is unique because it's able to make 4 covalent bonds. In its valence shell, carbon only has 4 valence electrons, which means it needs 4 more electrons to have a full valence shell, which means it will form 4 bonds. And because it can form 4 bonds, it can form lots of different shapes of molecules. So you can see here, carbons can form like a straight molecule. It can form a ring-shaped molecule. It can form branched molecules. It can also form single bonds. You can see these 2 carbons are bonded with a single bond. They can be double bonds and triple bonds. So because carbon can make so many bonds, it has lots of different options what shape molecule it can make or the type of covalent bond it can make. And therefore, this allows carbon to create lots of different types of molecules. So let's talk a little bit about what a basic organic molecule looks like. So any basic organic molecule has 2 main parts. And the first part that it has is called the carbon skeleton. And what a carbon skeleton is, it's a chain of carbon atoms in an organic molecule. And usually you see lots of hydrogens coming off of the carbon skeleton. So you can see over here, all of these molecules are examples of carbon skeletons. So you can see I have long chains of carbons with stuff sticking off of them. And in this case, the stuff that's sticking off these carbon chains are mostly hydrogens. Carbon chains can have double bonds, as you can see in this molecule right here. Carbon skeletons can be in a ring shape, they can be in a linear shape, but these carbon skeletons act as the backbone for organic molecules. The other piece that an organic compound has is called a functional group. And a functional group, this is a really basic definition, but it's basically a group of atoms that are found on a carbon skeleton. And the important thing about a functional group is a functional group dictates the properties of that molecule. Basically, depending on which functional groups you have, that will influence which properties that molecule has as well. Now, the size and shape of the carbon skeleton also influence the properties of a molecule, but really, the functional groups has a stronger role to play. Functional groups really dictate the properties of a molecule. So I'm going to give you some examples here of different functional groups, and I'm going to point out there are many functional groups, but however, there are a couple that are really important for this class that I want you to be familiar with, okay? So the first functional group that you should be familiar with is called a hydroxyl group, and a hydroxyl group is basically an OH, okay? So what you can see here, here's my carbon skeleton, that's this portion right here, and then I've stuck on this OH group right here, and that OH group is the functional group that's stuck onto my carbon skeleton. And if you stick an OH onto something, basically what that does is it usually creates an alcohol. So the property that the OH functional group gives is it makes a molecule an alcohol, makes it behave like an alcohol. So another functional group that you need to be familiar with is the carboxyl group. And the carboxyl group is this group right here. You can see it looks like a C double bonded to an O with an OH sticking off of it. And if you put this group onto a carbon skeleton, it makes that molecule acidic usually. Okay. So the next group that you have to know is called the amino group. And the amino group is this group right here. You either see it as an NH2 or an NH3, depending on what form it's in. And if you stick this group onto a carbon skeleton, it makes the molecule basic. And then finally, the last group that you should be familiar with is the phosphate group. And this is basically a bunch of phosphorus atoms linked with a lot of oxygens. And this group is, you can see it's negatively charged. So whatever it's stuck onto often has a negative charge. Okay, and this group is going to become really important when we look at DNA later in the year. It's found in DNA molecules. And it's also found in this molecule called ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. So just keep those things in mind. It's often abbreviated, but it's a P. But when we put a P, we really mean this functional group right here. Okay. So if I take different carbon skeletons and combine different functional groups onto those carbon skeletons, it will give the molecules different properties. And depending on which properties and which functional groups a molecule get, we can basically create 4 different categories of organic molecules. And these 4 different categories of organic molecules we call the macromolecules. So these are the 4 types of molecules that we're going to look at in more detail in this unit. So the 4 types are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And if you look at some pictures of these molecules over here, you can see they are mainly made up of carbon skeletons. So each of these rings is shorthand for a carbon skeleton. But then you can see groups that we just talked about. You can see that hydroxyl group, you can see a phosphate group over here. There's an amino group right here. So you can see how these different macromolecules are really just carbon skeletons that have these functional groups stuck onto them. So before we can really start talking about each of the macromolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, we first have to understand some basic vocabulary. So it turns out macromolecules are very, very big molecules that are basically made up of repeating units. So I want to introduce 2 vocabulary words here. I want to introduce the word polymer, and I want to introduce the word monomer. So you can imagine that what a polymer is a long chain of repeating units. So this might be a bunch of similar molecules that are linked together in one large molecule. I think a nice analogy is to think of a train, right? A train is a long chain that's made up of smaller, similar units. So each little car on the train is a unit. They're all kind of similar to one another, but they're all linked together in one long polymer. So you can kind of think, if I had a bunch of similar molecular units that were linked together, the whole big molecule would be a polymer. Each of these little units, each of the little train cars are called a monomer. So mono means one, so mono is my one small unit, and poly means many, so a polymer is what you get when you link many repeating units, many repeating monomers together. So if you look in the body, there are many, many, many different types of macromolecules or polymers that we see. There are many diverse molecules. I mean, it turns out the reason that molecules are so diverse and different, and the reason we can have so many molecules, millions of molecules that are all different from one another, is because we can have, basically what we do is we have a very limited set of monomers. We have a small set of units that we combine together in different ways to create different polymers. So you can kind of imagine, you can think about the alphabet. There are only 26 letters in the alphabet, but there's infinite numbers of combinations that we can make from that small number of monomers. So similarly, we have a small number of repeating units that we can link together to make bigger molecules that do different jobs in the body. So as an example, if you look at the macromolecule proteins, there are millions and millions and millions of different proteins in your body, but there are only 20 smaller units that are linked together to build these proteins. There's only 20 monomers that we can link together to make these large number of diverse polymers. So the last thing I want to do is talk about how we build a polymer from monomers, or also how we take a polymer and break it down into monomers. So there's two reactions you have to know here. So the first reaction is called dehydration synthesis. So I want to break up this word a little bit. So synthesis means to build, and dehydration means to remove water. Basically what this word means is we are going to build something bigger by removing water. So I want you to imagine that here I have 4 different monomers. So I have 1 monomer, 2 monomer, 3 monomer, and 4 monomers. And I'm trying to link these together to make a larger polymer. Now the first 3 have already been linked together already in a previous reaction. So now what I'm trying to do is take this 4th monomer and stick it onto the chain of the first 3. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to remove a water molecule. So you can see I'm going to take the H from one monomer and the OH from another. If I remove that, it makes water. So that's my dehydration piece. And then if I remove that H and that OH, it leaves this bond right here that's now open and this bond that's here that's now open. So they combine and bond together to build a larger molecule. I have synthesized a larger molecule by dehydrating it, by taking away water. So that's how we build polymers from monomers. And then in the opposite reaction, if I want to take a polymer and break it down into smaller pieces, breaking down into its monomers, I do a reaction called hydrolysis. So hydro means water, and the word lysis, the root lys, means to cut. So here I am using water to cut up something. I'm cutting up a bigger molecule into a smaller one. So you can see here I'm adding a water in. This is breaking a bond. And then the H from the water ends up on one side, the OH on the other, and now I'm effectively broken down my polymer into a monomer. So in the next video, we'll look at how some of this stuff applies to carbohydrates. But for now, I'll see you to the next video.